For the next session of Democratizing Data, I will bring you Sebastian Cushing Rodriguez. He's the portfolio lead of the events and training team. Sebastian, I'm going to give you the floor.
Hi, Lars, and hi again to all of you. We're back to present the next session of our Democratizing Data Summit. In this conversation, we'll explore the relationship between data journalism and news coverage of the far right. I'm happy to welcome back our colleague Tara Kelly to moderate this discussion. Tara is data editor for datajournalism.com, and joining her is Haeyoun Park from the New York Times and Benedict Witzenberger from the Süddeutsche Zeitung. In this discussion, we'll look at how data journalism can serve as a powerful tool when covering far-right movements in the times of national elections. So, Tara, I pass it over to you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Today, thanks so much for joining us on data journalism versus the far right, the US and Germany at a crossroads. As we all know, far-right movements in the United States and Europe are nothing new. They've been around for decades, but in recent years, they've grown larger and potentially become a threat to Western democracies. We witnessed this in the United States with the most recent US elections, followed by the Capitol riots in January. But we're also equally seeing this in Germany, where we have the upcoming elections this September. And white supremacy in the United States has basically been the primary form of exclusionary ideology, and it's therefore critical to understanding the American far right. But what can European journalists take away from this experience? And for today's panel session, we'll be discussing the challenges covering these far right groups in both the United States and Germany, but we'll also be looking at what the data says about the threat that these groups pose. We invite everyone to please ask your questions in the chat. But first, let's get started with Haeyoun Park. Haeyoun joins us from the New York Times, where she is assistant graphics editor, as well as she's also worked on the politics desk as an editor for the 2018 and 2020 US elections. I wonder if you could talk to us about what it was like to cover this past election cycle. I mean, the United States has never been so divided or polarized even. Talk to us what it was like editorially to plan for this and what it meant for your coverage.
Sure. Well, first, Tara, thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be here. There are many challenges covering the 2020 election. It was definitely by far like nothing like we've seen before. After 4 very tumultuous years of Trump's presidency, there is definitely a lot at stake here. And on top of that, covering a presidential election in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic was definitely a first for all of us. And in the US, all the rules on voting had changed because of the pandemic. Campaigning was different. There was very little in-person campaigning by the candidates happening. The pandemic just changed the way we vote in general, allowing for mail voting, at a scope that we've never seen before. And so initially we focused a lot on trying to inform readers on all the ways that they can vote by mail, and all the rules obviously were very different by state. So we focused a lot of our efforts on trying to get that information out. And as we got closer to the actual election, we try to prepare for what we expected to be a potentially contested election. Trump and Republicans were not supportive of mail voting, and we suspected, a lot of states wouldn't start counting the votes until after people went to the polls, after polls closed. So we suspected that, the results could be called into question. So we, in the days leading up to the election, we did a graphic that let people know what happens in a contested election, what happens after election night, when you should expect votes. And we did sort of prepare for the possibility of Trump challenging the results, which, it definitely did happen. And, all the lawsuits, even though they were thrown out. So we did sort of prepare for all of this. The results actually provided a really good window into the American electorate. And there were some surprises. What this election showed us was that I mean, Biden won, but it was pretty clear that Trump's grip across the nation was still very, very strong. As you can see, if you can show the slide election turnout slide, what we saw was that turnout was up everywhere on both sides. Trump picked up 10 million new voters then in 2016. And yeah, as you see, this is part of a graphic that we did on turnout across the country. And, not only did Biden do better, in terms of turning out voters than Clinton in 2016, Trump did better than himself and, found a new trove of voters across the country, even beyond, the white rural base that sort of, gave him the victory in 2016. What we were sort of looking at in addition to this was, we did an analysis of the 2,600 U.S. counties across the country where we had results, and we saw that Trump support was very, very strong, and in the places that swung right in 2016, they continued to swing further right as there's one other slide here called Election Trump. If we can take a look at that, all the counties that swung in 2016 to the right continue to swing right in 2020. And he not only maintained support, many of them swung even further right than in 2016. So by looking at these data sets, we're able to really show our readers how strong Trump's support still was across the country. And immediately after the election, another thing we noticed was surprisingly large shifts to the right among Latino voters in Miami and the Rio Grande Valley. And to investigate whether this pattern was repeated across the country, we spent a couple of months actually assessing and mapping shifts in voting in 28,000 precincts in more than 20 cities. And if we can look at some of the slides for the election shift slide, you'll see that in city after city, we found that areas, there are quite a lot of areas in these large cities that shifted toward Mr. Trump gave him more, where his margin increased than in 2016, basically. A lot of these places are Democratic strongholds, so they still voted for Biden, but you'll see the shifts are pretty amazing. In spite of his policies and remarks that have been widely expected to alienate immigrants and voters of color, we saw, in Chicago, if we can go through some of the other slides, like in Chicago, if you look at the areas that are shaded in yellow, those are the areas that are more than 50% Latino, and you see the big, shifts to the right. And then we saw it again in this is Miami with the, majority Cuban areas. And then we also saw the same pattern in Houston, in New York, and even LA, and we saw in LA, what's interesting is it wasn't just the Latino voters in Orange County, right south of LA, there's a very predominantly Vietnamese neighborhood, Westminster and Garden Grove, and those areas also shifted heavily right. And when some of our reporters went on the ground to talk to some of them, everybody had, there's different reasons, but one voter said, well, Trump is a businessman just like me, and so there are various reasons why people supported Trump, but it was pretty surprising to us, the level of shifting that we saw in these immigrant Asian Latino neighborhoods.
Oh, absolutely. And, some of Donald Trump's supporters identify with far-right movements. We saw this firsthand with the storming of the Capitol last January. And sometimes we hear these phrases or these terms, Proud Boys, QAnon, neo-Nazis being used to describe them. I'm curious, what does the shape of the far-right in the United States look like today? And how is it evolving? And how is the threat maybe changing over the past 10 years?
Yeah. Well, what we noticed, I'm definitely not a far right expert by any means, but what I can tell you about is sort of what we've noticed trying to cover the Capitol riots and the fallout from the Capitol riot in January. And what we noticed in trying to understand the people involved in the riot is that there appears to be more of a mass movement of people who don't belong to an extremist group formally these days, and but who hold these like extremist thoughts and beliefs, which in a way is actually more frightening because it becomes harder to catalog and to track, right? And when we looked at, this is what we learned from looking at the people who were arrested for their roles in the Capitol riot. And when we cataloged them, what we found is that yes, there were definitely people who were organized and who were members of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, or adhered to like QAnon. But the vast majority were just a horde of radicals who were there, and with the belief that the election was stolen. And it's pretty remarkable how kind of seemingly ordinary some of these people are. And people have different, motivating political beliefs, but you kind of dig deeper, and they're all just kind of just these ordinary radicals, more than people who belong to specific extremist groups.
And is there any other specific data you have on these far-right movements? And also, I'm curious, how do you think data journalism is critical to measuring this threat? And what should we be mindful of when we're reporting on them?
Yeah, well, what we're, as I was just saying, because it's more of this mass movement of the ordinary, I think we need to be mindful that this is potentially in all corners of our lives, right? It's not just in one place, and it's like going to be harder to track by just looking at the Proud Boys and just looking at the Oath Keepers. I think we're seeing it kind of appear in very and we're seeing like religious ties. We're seeing a lot of this like same beliefs and thinking sort of resonate in the Christian communities, right? And so like many of them. Many of the people who came to the Capitol riot came with a belief that the election was stolen from Trump. And that is sort of like, one sort of feature that tied all of them together. But, what we're sort of hearing and seeing is that a lot of people, including in Europe and I think in Germany, there's more of an elusive movement, and they're all kind of connected, but it's not really clear how dangerous or organized that they are necessarily. And that's what makes it even harder for us to measure and track. And we talked to experts as we were covering the Capitol riot fallout, and what they're saying is that the majority appear to be individuals who are not like card-carrying members of particular groups, but there's really nothing they're identifying with other than this overarching set of ideologies or misinformation. A lot of the information on social media they just start feeding off of each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that brings us over to Benedict, who is a data journalist at SZ. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Benedict Witzenberger, welcome. Now, Benedict, talk to us about maybe what's happening in Germany with these upcoming elections. Why are these so important? Why do they matter?
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. Just to give you a short overview, we are going to have elections on September 26th. And they're going to be pretty exciting for German elections because as we don't have a term limit like in the US, you can stay German Chancellor, our most prominent member of government, for as long as you get elected. And we now have the case that Angela Merkel has been Chancellor for 16 years and she's not running. So there will be a change for the head of government, and those three are the candidates who want to succeed her. And I just want to point you out to the names. Armin Laschet on the left is the candidate for the Conservatives, so Angela Merkel's party. And he's currently Minister President or governor, as you could probably say, of North Rhine-Westphalia in the west of Germany. Olaf Scholz on the right is the current Secretary of Finance or Treasury, and he's Social Democrat. So Conservatives and Social Democrats form a coalition currently. And the woman in the middle is Annalena Baerbock, and she's the candidate for the Greens. And that is extraordinary that there is a candidate for the Green Party which does have chances of becoming the next chancellor in Germany, which has a lot to do with the climate crisis, which is a huge topic over here, especially regarding our car manufacturers that obviously still sell a lot of fuel-driven cars, but that have to get a change or get a shift to electric vehicles. And there's kind of a feeling that there needs to be some form of change in Germany, especially concerning the administration. We had a lot of issues during COVID, which showed that the administration for itself does not work like it probably should in the 21st century. One example, a lot of local authorities had to transmit the case numbers to the government using fax machines because there's no digital way of transmitting that. And that showed a lot of people that there's really an issue going on that needs to be tackled. And a lot of people have the impression that the conservatives are not able to do that because they've been in power for 16 years now. Before that, there was a social democrat, but even before that, there was another chancellor, Helmut Kohl, for another 16 years, and he was also a conservative candidate or conservative politician. So, well, there are some real issues, and there's some call for change that might have an effect on the outcomes of the elections this September.
Fascinating. Now, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the right wing in Germany. Maybe you could talk to us about the different movements, like the North Cross movement, and how do they fit into the political landscape there? And also, it would be great to hear about, what happened with Franco A case. Yeah.
There are a couple of things that I want to unentangle because there are a couple of things that might be concerning. So, first of all, on a political level, we do have a right-wing party, which is called Alternative for Germany, or AfD. They are also running for chancellor, but there's no way they might form a coalition, which they might need to be chancellor. So, they exist, and they do have electorate. We're probably going to talk about them later. But they're not playing that huge role that Donald Trump plays in the US. But Nordkreuz is very interesting. It is, I find some headlines by the New York Times, and I think it's pretty concerning when you find that many headlines about right-wing extremism in your country, especially when it's about German police and military. So maybe we can put those headlines up just to give you a short impression. So basically, there are a couple of things that come together, which we found out they kind of belong together in a way. So Nordkreuz, that you mentioned, is a chat group, and I think it's probably still active, of preppers who are preparing for a day X. A day on which the state authority breaks down and they have to take over with guns or with violence, and they want to be prepared, and they also, and that's concerning, they also created kill lists of members of the public that might be detained or that might be killed on that day X. And there's not also Nordkreuz. There are those groups for all different kinds or different areas of Germany. There's also Südkreuz for the south and Westkreuz for the west that have similar aims. But the interesting thing is those headlines and those groups are connected to the Hannibal network. So there's something bigger, and I think we got an infographic that shows this network that was done by a German left-wing news media, by a newspaper who, maybe we can. There it is, right? They broke that story actually. So this network was discovered in 2018, and Hannibal is the nickname of a German army sergeant who was the admin of multiple of those Kreuz groups, of those prepper chat groups. And part of those groups were also members of different SWAT teams in Germany. There's one in Frankfurt that just recently was dissolved. And some were also members of the German equivalent to the SEAL teams, as you would say. KSK is the German expression for that. There were also some judges and some people that worked for intelligence service. So people who might be trained on weapons, which is actually pretty concerning. And there is also, there's also a connection to Franco A. And Franco A. A is just the first letter of his last name, because he's currently facing trial in Germany, and German libel laws usually don't allow to give a full name for someone who's appearing in court. Franco A. is a second lieutenant in the German army, and he was arrested at the airport in Vienna, in Austria, in 2017. And he was arrested while he wanted to retrieve a hidden weapon from a bathroom that he stored there. And once he was arrested, this whole story and this whole connection to the Hannibal network came to light. And Franco A., it's a totally crazy case. He pretended to be a refugee in 2015, when a lot of refugees, especially from Syria, arrived in Germany. And he applied for asylum in Germany at that time. And there is the suspicion that he might wanted to kill some politician or some public figure to and pretend to be a refugee to incite hatred against refugees here in Germany. He was accused in 2017, but by that time the court refused to start a trial, and it went into a couple of higher courts. And right now he's facing trial in Frankfurt. It's currently underway. Yeah, and it sounds like whenever I read about the story, I always think it's totally crazy what's going on here. But actually, there's been some reporting about that issue, but it's still a little opaque. You don't really know that many details. Yeah, and well, there are some experts, to mention this, which argue that those are basically some isolated cases. I mean, there are 180,000 soldiers in the German military, and these might be just a couple of them. But they have been found to, where they have been preparing those kill lists. They've been in these chat groups. Some of them also stole ammunition and buried it in some hidden places. Some experts argue, well, this is not a proof that there's a shadow army in the German military preparing for some day X, but it's pretty concerning. And it's also concerning that there are no major convictions up to this point. I mean, there have been minor convictions for ammunition, for the stolen ammunition, but nothing in terms of this conspiracy that you might see in this network, actually. Just to mention this, there is a current series on the New York Times podcast, The Daily, about this whole issue. So for someone who might dig a little deeper, that might be a place to start.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wonder, as a data journalist, what are some of the ways to measure the growth and power of these movements, particularly in Germany? And I wonder if there's any more detail you have on the numbers and the growing threat, if it is indeed a growing threat.
Yeah, some of my colleagues did an analysis on Telegram groups, which are the place for those people to communicate. Westkreuz has also been actually on Telegram. But what my colleagues focused on was Telegram groups, right-wing Telegram groups, or COVID-related Telegram groups. So just to kind of measure the communication that's taking part there. And maybe we can show the graphic. There is a graphic of the Telegram groups, which is actually a circle kind of thing. Yeah, this one. So what they wanted to do, they were scraping the data. So they were saving the data out of these groups regularly. And they tried to measure hate during the last year in those groups. And what you can see here is actually kind of the number or the share of hate that you could find in those groups. They had a dictionary of a couple of, I think, maybe 2,000 words or something, that had some connection to hate into different categories. And they were trying to find those words or these idioms in the data. And it was very interesting. As you can see, well, the hate increases, especially in the last half year that the data covers. But once you break it down into the different types or categories of groups that we're following, there's not so much difference in QAnon or right radical groups. I think we got a, yeah, right. As you can see, the hate level, so to say, kind of stays constant over time. But once the explanation is they've always been very hateful in their conversations. But you see an upward trend in groups that are classified as conspiracy theorists or COVID groups that we have here. So you kind of see a increase of the hate in groups that might start as or they might have started as groups that were discussing about the COVID policy, the political decisions, maybe families not being allowed into nursing homes to visit their loved ones, children not being allowed to go to school, the fear of someone losing their job. That might be the place where those groups started, but they kind of evolved and radicalized over time. That was one of the learnings that we had from this project. And the kind of disturbing learning, you could say, and the thing that we're still struggling with and that we're still thinking about is, will those groups cool down once COVID is over, which might be sometime soon, hopefully, maybe after the election, when we all have like a 4-year period of cooling down again? Or are those groups going to stay there and create kind of a counter public, which people might use to radicalize themselves and do what you don't want to know what they're going to do?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to sort of hear what that connection is with COVID and these groups. Benedict and Haeyoun, if you both want to weigh in there.
Haeyoun, you want to go first?
Oh, go first, Benedict.
Okay.
You can continue.
But the interesting, I mean, I think as I've mentioned, I guess a lot of them started out as really complaining about the political decisions that that were taken during COVID. So I think it could really be like everybody just joining them and having the discussions. And what strikes me is this evolution that they take. That over time, I think a lot of people, well, they had COVID, everyone was staying inside, so you might have spent some more time on your phone being in those groups. But this evolution of becoming more and more radicalized is, yes, it's really concerning. And that's what really strikes me. I'm not sure if COVID just was the spark that started this movement, and now it's there, and there's no way it's going to stop being there, or if it's really topic specific, and when COVID is over, you might still argue about political decisions, but they are not that far-reaching or that are not that close to your everyday life as some COVID decisions might have been.
I think, with COVID, one of the things that we noticed, and I maybe we're going to talk about this later, but there's a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in the U.S. right now, and it is a real thing, and we have noticed that it's growing. And a couple of months ago, we did a data project where we tried to track every anti-Asian incident since like COVID really started taking a toll in the U.S. Last March, and we just noticed a tremendous spike in cases, and a lot of them, a lot of the cases that we cataloged involved racist, very hateful language, and a lot of them actually refer directly to COVID. And I think there is this, there's definitely this deep like racial status anxiety going on, and Trump has fed into it. And, the way COVID is portrayed on social media and the way Trump has called, COVID the China virus, I think all of that has sort of fed into to all the misinformation, on social media that is sort of taken by some of these, by Americans, whether or not they belong to a far right group. I think it's just become, part of the conversation. And now that like big tech companies are cracking down on some of this on social media, like Telegram or like, messaging apps like Telegram, there are like memes of Asian people like eating dogs and characters and starting COVID. And it's just a sign that this anti-Asian sentiment has flared up in like just all corners of the internet, and it's amplifying racist and xenophobic tropes. And I think, a lot of this, it's not necessarily just, people who belong to the far right groups. And I keep saying this over and over, but it's something that we are starting to notice that it's less people who, identify necessarily with a specific group, but it's just, people who hold these beliefs and they are spreading them on social media and feeding off of each other.
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
I
just ask you a question. You mentioned this project. Oh, sorry, Tara. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
You mentioned this project that you were collecting the data on these incidents that were happening. I was wondering, did you have to do this because there was no data available on this topic? Do it yourself, and what were your sources in this particular case?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, it was really hard to track this data because there really isn't a government agency like at the federal, state, or local level that does this in a comprehensive way. And so, with the lack of that data from the government, as in, many other cases, we just decided that we just come up with a system to really kind of catalog this ourselves. And, it's very limited in scope, I admit, but what we ended up doing was looking at every incident that was reported by local media. And so we looked, and so it was our universe in the end when we published this a couple months ago was maybe 100 cases, but we decided it was a narrow universe, but it was something that we felt good about because we knew it was reported and we had video evidence, we had photographic evidence that we can sort of, vet ourselves. And, even that in itself allowed us a window into some of the violence that was happening.
I was just going to say like how shocked I was. I was recently in the United States and I noticed just the media literacy level is just so low and how people are just really absorbing stuff, not asking questions about where the source is coming from. And they're not far right. Like they're people, maybe some of them are Trump supporters, but they don't identify with those movements. So I think it's very interesting to sort of, hear that. And I wonder, as an Asian American yourself, what steps are you taking in your daily life to protect yourself for this rise in Asian hate that maybe was there a while ago, but the recent attacks and what's happened has kind of heightened that?
Mm-hmm. It definitely has. And so this is very personal to me because, as an Asian American, woman living, in a big city like this, I haven't actually, because we're all working still from home still, I haven't had a commute into the office. I haven't stepped foot inside Times Square in like more than a year. But come September when the company starts calling us back, I'm going to have to get on that bus. I'm going to have to go through Port Authority. I'm going to have to walk the streets of New York. And I am definitely frightened, and my husband has been already commuting into the city. And I tell him not to take public transportation, to drive into the city, do his business, and then come back home because it really has hit home. And it's a very, very, I am very frightened for about the violence. And it is a very real thing going on.
Yeah. It's interesting because my brother-in-law is actually a Syrian refugee in Germany, and there was an attack in his city called Halle Sal, and there was one that was on a synagogue and another later that was on like a kebab shop, a halal, but they were all saying to themselves, oh my God, before the news broke of who did it, they were worried it was a Syrian and what the backlash was going to be. And I remember him saying to me, I know this sounds terrible, but I really hope it's some white supremacist and not, a refugee, because the backlash and of what you get from that is just, it's really concerning. But yeah, I wonder if we could go back to talking about the elections with the polling. Now, this is something data journalists can't really, escape when there's an election. And I just wonder if, Benedict, you could talk to us a little bit about what you're doing with predictive polling, and also, Haeyoun, maybe you could also weigh in of how you guys handled that with your coverage for the New York Times.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting because a lot of the inspiration that we're taking for our reporting on the elections is basically coming from the US. I mean, that's basically the NYT and the Washington Post that are like the lighthouses for data journalism. That's as it is. Well, I've prepared a chart on the current state of the race of the German of the German election that we might want to show. I've already mentioned the Greens, which they being in chance of being the next chancellor. It's crazy and pretty interesting. But there's also this right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany, which I've already mentioned, that was founded in 2013. Actually, in a response to the financial crisis, where there were European loans going to countries like Greece that had high debts, and it was basically, in a way, you could say, German taxpayer money, and a lot of people didn't like that. But, well, they paid back that loan sometimes, so this AfD, this party, already decreased in size, but then the migration crisis started in 2015, and that was like the huge topic of Germany being overrun by people from the Middle East, which in 2015, well, you could argue there was 1 million people coming, which is actually a huge number for a country with 80 million population. But, well, you really don't experience that a lot anymore right now. But, well, so this crisis was over sometime, and then COVID started, kind of. And now the AfD is like the party that which plays down all the COVID issues, which plays down the need to wear masks, which tries to sell itself as the voice of the little guy who is losing his or her job against those up there in a business or government, which is like their role, which I think connects closely to Trump in a lot of ways. But it's pretty hard, going back to the predictive polling thing, it's pretty hard to actually estimate their potential because they are expected, or people are expected, people who are voting for them are expected not to answer the polls truthfully. Well, they actually don't show that much variation in their polling. But, well, we don't know. There have been local elections in a federal state in Saxony-Anhalt 2 weeks ago. And they've been pretty strong there in 2016 in the last elections. And they actually lost there. And Saxony-Anhalt is a state in the eastern Germany, which still tends to vote more, which has a higher voting potential, you could say, for the AfD than the West usually. Well, you might take this as a signal that they are not getting that much potential out of COVID, which you might think for the right-wing political parties. Yeah, from the data journalistic side, it's absolutely a interesting election with a lot of uncertainty. There will be a change in the government, which is pretty interesting for itself, I think. And we are using a model to kind of predict the outcome of the election this year. It's the first time. We've always been kind of reluctant because explaining a model is kind of hard, and you will always have people that don't understand what you're doing. But we came to the conclusion that polls for themselves are models as well, and people tend not to understand them that good. So what we're trying to do now is actually focus a lot on showing the uncertainty in the data, starting from building a average on polls. So we're not trying to show distinct polls. We're trying to show an average that kind of shows the uncertainty, and we are trying to show kind of a range of estimates in different ways that give you that never will tell you this is got to be a result, which is always got to be kind of embedded in there is a chance that this result might happen, or there is another chance that this result might happen. And that's what makes it so hard, is that we're almost certainly will have a coalition government. So we don't have the situation that you just have two parties and you can the one party's gains are the other party's losses. You have to kind of figure out a way to show the uncertainty in different coalition combinations, which is hard in a way, you could say. So for us, it's kind of a in a way uncharted territory, and we have a lot of internal discussions about what to show and what not to show, and how much explanation we will need for our graphics. That's what I always argue. We're also reporting on polls, which basically are using a model as well, and we're also doing reporting on the weather forecast. With a lot of care that we're taking, we might be able to explain political modeling in a way that might work for people.
And I wonder if, Haeyoun, when you were working on the politics desk for this, and you also have your graphics hat on too, right? Because you're you're assistant graphics editor, but you're also moving to the politics. What were some of the concerns you guys had with the polling?
I mean,
issues?
we know. Yeah, I mean, we definitely know from 2016 how flawed polling can be, and polling clearly has some serious challenges. So what we tried to do was sort of take everything, take all the context from the different types of polling and sort of look at the polling resources as a whole rather than relying on certain ones. And I think we try to be even more mindful of that. I mean, we always have been, but I think we try to be even more mindful after 2016 in the, while we were assessing the 2020 election. And even so, I think you have to just take it with a grain of salt. All the polling, we just have to take with a grain of salt. I mean, it is sort of the best measure before, an election. I mean, there's really no way around, some of we have to have polls, and we have to, just accept them and accept them for the, with the limitations that they come with. And, I think in 2020, the polling really underestimated Trump support, and it was yet again, they sort of underestimated Trump support. So it's something that we just need to constantly be mindful of. And I think the polling industry is starting to reassess ways to improve. But I mean, I'm not really sure that I have the answer, but the way we approached it was we look at everything that's out there and then try to take in, try to take the big takeaway from it, the overall arching takeaway, rather than relying on the individual polls themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, I'd like to go to Angela and see if there's any questions from the audience.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Hi, Jan and Benedict. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's amazing. And we have the question from Andrea. Andrea asked, since the far-right movements are usually associated with misinformation, I wonder if they work with fellow fact-checkers? I mean, you.
Is that a question for me?
For both of you, yeah.
Okay. Well, we don't, at least at the New York Times, we don't have fact checkers. We are our own fact checkers. So the way, we approach this is we rely on just regular traditional reporting to vet any sort of misinformation that we might be reporting on. And I think, what we're very mindful of, as we're reporting on some of these groups and what they're doing is just being very mindful not to like amplify their messages while explaining, you know, what they're about. And that's something that we're constantly talking about. And even when we're covering, you know, Trump and the language that he was using, we were always having discussions about how not to amplify, you know, the information that he was spreading. And one piece that just comes to mind that you know, my colleagues worked on is looking at all of the times, all the ways that Trump spread misinformation about the election. And, you know, we just put together a 38-minute video showing all the instances that Trump, you know, talked about how the election was stolen and how he lied about how the election was fraudulent. And then we also looked at the language that was being used at the Capitol riot by the rioters and by the, and, you know, they were mimicking his language, and they were, you know, basically using some of the same language that Trump was using. And, you know, they were misinformed, but we were, you know, we kind of put together a piece to show what was happening, but we were very mindful of not making sure that the videos themselves don't get spread on social media by themselves without context. So we're always, you know, I think context is very, very important. You know, when you're reporting on the far right and when you're reporting on misinformation, and that's what we're always considering.
Well, I can second that. We don't have like the traditional claim checking fact checkers. We're also doing it similarly like the New York Times seems to do it by just selecting editorially selecting the claims on which to report on, but mainly in the context that explains why something is. I think just to add this to my earlier answers, I mean, I'm very glad we don't have a persona like Donald Trump in Germany, which is in a very powerful position and is just spreading lies, basically. But we are seeing suspicions being raised by the right-wing politicians as well, especially on social media, about mail-in voting, which, well, you could see whenever there's an election somewhere in Germany, they're going to raise that. So there is this tendency to discredit kind of the electoral process, but I don't expect something Trump-like to happen here after the September elections.
We have time for one last question, and that goes for you, Benedict, because I mean, Sebastian wants to know about the situation in Germany. So I wanted to reference Germany privacy laws again. How does German law prevent data journalists, if at all, from being able to fully understand the right-wing threat?
That's an interesting question. Well, as my colleagues did with the Telegram project, this is kind of reporting when you enter private chat groups, well, semi-private, because they took people in. It usually that's not that much of an issue when you are thinking about editorial processes, but if you want to work on data that might come from a governmental process, that might get interesting. Or when you're talking about support for parties, financial support for parties, that is always pretty hard because you usually don't get that much information on the individuals that support certain organizations because they are protected by privacy laws. From a journalistic perspective, well, we can do a lot of things. We just have to be careful what we publish. But during the research process, we can do a lot of things.
Thank you so much, Benedict, for your answer. And unfortunately, we don't have much time, so I need to wrap up here. Thank you so much, Sarah, for moderating this panel. Thank you to Benedict and to Haeyoun for being here today and being part of democratizing data. This conversation was very insightful for all of us for the time being and for the new challenges we may face in the near future. Thank you again.